Okay, Frank, today I thought we should look at the Arab Spring again and try and give it some context, since spring suggests summer and summer seems to be a long time coming. So that presumably means that there's something about the process that we don't understand, and we need to try to understand more what is behind that process. The events in Syria have been continuing to get worse, but not going anywhere. And in the meantime, things have been happening in Egypt and Tunisia, which some people interpret as hopeful, but still they don't seem to be going anywhere. And there have been some pretty bad things happening as well.
Yes.
I don't know what has gripped your attention, but one thing that makes me wonder is the gender relations issues that keep appearing.
Mm-hmm.
There was something in the paper yesterday or the day before again about virginity testing.
Mm-hmm.
What has virginity testing got to do with progress towards democracy?
Mm-hmm.
And then earlier on in Cairo again, while Western news reporters were doing their job and bringing news of events in Tahrir Square to Western television audiences, an American woman journalist was grabbed, taken away, and really violently abused.
Mm-hmm.
And these things have been in our press, but nobody has explained them and nobody's linked them to what actually is going on. And it seems to me that it must be related in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So how can one explain these bad things in this as part of this process, when it's a process that we are welcoming so enthusiastically?
I think that it's very interesting to me, because in the whole time that I've been observing I guess the sectarian regimes, if you will, past 30 years or so. Now, I've always been struck by the urbane or cosmopolitan nature, and I mean, I'll go ahead and say it. I know this is sort of an academic discussion, but the sexiness, if you will, of the first ladies of a number of these countries. And I'm thinking about Mrs. Sadat. I'm thinking about King Hussein's second wife, Queen Alia, who was killed in a helicopter crash. I'm thinking about his third wife, Lisa Halaby. I'm thinking about the wife of the current King of Jordan, King Abdullah's wife, who's a Palestinian, who's quite attractive and has been photographed frequently and is clearly a Western photograph magnet. I'm thinking about President Assad, the current President Assad, his own wife, who's also quite attractive. And I'm thinking about Mubarak's wife, Suzanne, I believe, who I think was either French or a Francophile. And I've never understood that the tippy top of the government/social triangle, you have these first ladies who could be first ladies in the United States without missing a beat. And yet the whole infrastructure below that, the religious infrastructure, is so diametrically different than that. Women with burqas, women with subject to virginity testing, women being treated the way the cultural interpretation of Islam would be treated.
I think you're bringing up some very interesting things, and let me add three more examples to make this a complete set, I think. One is we've had female prime ministers in two Islamic countries, Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan and the pair in Bangladesh,
Mm-hmm.
that have dominated politics there for some time. But more importantly even than those, because they're a different sort of case, in 1919 the then Afghan Shah, who was a modernizing character at the same time as Ataturk came to power in Turkey, and just before Reza Shah, a modernizing Shah, came to power in Iran, he forced, or I don't think he forced, he had his wife the Queen, appear in public in Afghanistan without a veil. And this was absolutely unprecedented, and it happened in Afghanistan before it happened anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, there were some other things going on in Cairo before that. There was a women's suffragette movement in Cairo before America. So there's a history to this sort of thing.
What's the purpose of that? This quote unquote official advancement of Western mores with political women like this? I mean, is it done to do what? To symbolize to the rest of the country that there's an alternative? Is it? I don't understand it.
I wouldn't go so far as to say that the people who were doing it did it for a specific reason, but it's interesting that so much that gets into the news to us about anything going on in the Middle East has a gender connection.
Mm-hmm.
And I started thinking about this specifically a couple of years ago when, at the end of March in 2009, a 16, 17-year-old young woman in Swat, Pakistan, in north of Islamabad, was arrested for leaving her house in the company of a man she was not related to.
Mm-hmm.
And a week later, after being tried, she was sentenced to 34 lashes
Mm-hmm.
that were carried out in public and were immediately on YouTube and broadcast around the world. Now, I think there's two very interesting things going on. One is that anything that's gender related tends to appeal immediately to Western audiences.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, there's a lot of different things going on that relate to gender. Some of them appear to be progressive and some of them appear to be absolutely retrogressive.
Yes.
But I think that the larger context for this is that gender relations are changing all over the world, and they've been changing for over a century now, with the suffragette movements in the West starting in Cairo, for that matter, starting at the beginning of the last century. It's from the 1950s, gender relations have been changing much faster in the Western world, and therefore as social change has accelerated in the West and accelerated much more slowly in the outside the Western world, gender relations seems to be what people focus on as what symbolizes change, whether they think the change is good or whether they think it's bad. And if they think it's good, they push it as far as they can. If they think it's bad, they fight against it as hard as they can. In the Islamic world, gender relations are even more at the core of the way people think of society than is the case in the Western world, because in the Western world we have all sorts of things we can belong to besides the family.
Mm-hmm.
But in Islamic law, the only legitimate social unit is the family and the household.
Mm-hmm.
And so as Western ideas that are the product of accelerating social change in the West percolate into the Islamic world, it's the relationship they have to gender which seems to be the biggest threat. And if it's the biggest threat, it's the thing that people react against most. Now,
if I may, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Several months ago, you introduced a well-known female former member of the Afghan parliament, or Jirga.
Julia.
Yes, down in Philadelphia. Again, not to assign any clairvoyance or ESP to you. If she was in this discussion with us now, what do you think she would say?
Well, that's interesting. I wish we could bring her in, and I should look for an opportunity to bring her in sometime. I'm not sure exactly where she is now, probably somewhere in Pakistan, but she has to be very careful
Sure.
because she's under threat all the time. But she's a particularly interesting person because she grew up in the west of Afghanistan, and a part of Afghanistan that is probably most isolated from the capital, and therefore most isolated from the westernization tendencies that have gradually been developing in Afghanistan, obviously with a big interruption over the last 20 years, but they've been developing since the 1920s. And yet she grew up with the idea that women should have equal rights with men, and to some extent, of course, those rights are in the Quran, except it's just that the society is organized in such a way that even though women are supposed to be equal in some things, they're supposed to be subordinate in others.
Right.
She campaigned at high school and then later on in the capital, and got herself invited to participate in the negotiations in 2005 for the new constitution of Afghanistan, and elected to parliament. And she continued to campaign for women's rights in parliament until she had to escape quickly before her campaign was terminated in an unpleasant way. But what she would say if she were asked this specific question, I don't know, simply because I think she would have difficulty talking about the sorts of things that I've introduced, i.e. virginity testing and the abuse of a female journalist. When it gets explicit, I think she would have difficulty talking about it, or at least I would have to prepare her very carefully, and I don't know whether I would be able to do that. The point seems to me to be that to add another example to this, which is that Muslim students in the Western world often come under strong criticism for being very free in their relations with women here in a way that they can't be in the Middle East.
Yes.
So I think that that helps us to understand what was going on with the American journalist, and very often the image of American women is an image of the fantasies of men who really have no experience of it. Mm-hmm. But the virginity testing idea was explained when the people who were perhaps responsible for it were challenged, as a way of making sure that they couldn't be accused later of having interfered with the women in any way themselves.
Right, right.
But I think that the whole thing has to be understood in terms of different levels of progress along a trajectory which is encompassing the whole world of the way males and females interrelate with each other. Mm-hmm. And that's something generally we only know about in the Western world. And because of the way news gets brought to us from the Middle East, and because of the Middle East's special concern with gender relations in the family, we hear of the worst incidents and the worst objections and the worst type of resistance from the Middle East. And this is what why we hear the negative things about the Arab Spring in this form.
Are there positive things occurring on this trajectory, do you think?
In fact, women are becoming much more active in public life in the Middle East. Women are challenging the Saudi
they are. That's a very good point. Yes.
Law against women driving. Women drive taxis in Tehran and buses. Mm-hmm. Everywhere you go, there is even the increase in the use of the headscarf. Mm-hmm. is in fact not a reversion to Islamic forms away from the modern world. It's a way of making it possible for women to take part in public life without being criticized by the men.
That's very interesting.
Well, I mean, obviously there are a lot of different ways of looking at this, but we tend to only interpret it in one way, and there are other ways of looking at it. So I think we've probably come to the end of this session, and we will continue it in the several trajectories we could take up related to this when we meet next.
Ron, this is very interesting. Thank you very much.